Have you guys ever wondered just how similar a Gibson reissue is to vintage? Like, I don't know, did they get it 80% right, 90%, 60%? Or maybe you don't really care about that stuff, but you love checking out cool guitars, particularly vintage Gibsons. Well, whatever can't be fallen, I think you're gonna enjoy the video I've got for you today. So the stars of the show are these two stunning vintage ES345s. They're both from the mid-60s, and they were loaned to me by a friend of the channel. Be sure to check out his Instagram. I've got it linked in the description below. So we're gonna take a close look at these two, just kind of document them, check them out. And then since I happen to own a 64 reissue, which is the blue one here, I thought, you know what, we might as well just compare and contrast all three. So we're gonna talk a little bit about how the custom shop reissue stacks up to the real thing. And as always, I've got timestamps set up for this video, so feel free to jump around to the specific portion you're most interested in. No hard feelings whatsoever. I know some of you don't want to hear me talk. You just want to get straight to the playing, while others kind of enjoy the nerding out a bit more. So both camps are welcome here. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's dive into the guitars. So we'll go from oldest to youngest, which would be starting here with the Sunburst ES345. So this guitar is from 1964. This guitar does still have the varitone, which is kind of semi-unusual. A lot of people convert these to 335 specs and take the varitone out. Some say it improves the tone, but that's debatable. This has had the conversion from stereo to mono, however, which I think may be the only universally, approved mod to vintage guitars out there. And you can actually see on the original truss rod cover, I'll get a close up, it says stereo. That's kind of an easy indication of how it was originally wired. So the original finish is pretty wild. It's got crazy checking on the front here. It actually might be the most intense, smallest checking I've ever personally seen on a guitar. And that's at least on the front. But if I go ahead and flip it, on the back, it has more traditional checking. So more of that kind of vertical or horizontal, depending how you look at it, lines. So the guitar shows just kind of general honest play wear, but it's in pretty good shape besides the checking. Now, this is a player grade guitar, so originality is a little tricky. The ABR is an unknown replacement. The tuners were replaced recently. The bridge pickup is likely not original, though it is a patent number Gibson pickup from roughly the same era. The pickguard is a replacement, and there might be other things I'm forgetting, but that's kind of the gist. It's been refretted as well. And finally, probably the coolest part of this guitar is the case it came with. It's got every vibey graphic you could ever imagine on it. Super cool. It's got the original owner's name sharpied on the inside. This is just an awesome guitar. Just kind of a really neat piece of Gibson history. Next up, we have this 1965 ES345. As you can see, in a very vibrant cherry red finish. This guitar is extremely clean. From a distance, you would never think it's 60 years old, especially sitting next to the 64. So this guitar, like the 64, has just a beautiful Brazilian rosewood fretboard, really awesome vibey inlays. It's got a little bit of checking if you catch it just in the right light, but it's very clean. On the back, it's got a little bit more wear and a little bit more checking, but overall very clean. It does also have kind of a flamed mahogany neck, which is something you don't see very often. Modification-wise, again, player grade guitar. So this does not have the varitone hooked up anymore and was also converted to mono. The entire wiring harness was actually recently replaced with VIP pots and historic makeover bumblebee caps. And then the pickup covers were also recently swapped over to throwback gold covers that are unaged and kind of aging naturally. This one does have a Faber ABR replacement bridge, and it was converted to stop tail. Normally these would have a trapeze tailpiece on them. Overall, just a really beautiful cherry red ES guitar from Gibson. Not much to dislike here. Finally, last and probably least is my personal ES345. So this is a Gibson custom shop from Memphis. It's a 1964 reissue, and the color is called Frost Blue. I get a lot of questions on that. Long story short, it is a historic Gibson color, though they never actually painted any ES guitars in it way back then. So just a limited run they did in 2016, 2017. They only made a few of them. I don't know how many, but not a lot. So this guitar has had its fair share of mods done to it since I purchased it new. The most substantial would be rewiring to mono 50 style. And then I also had the varitone wired to a push-pull pot so that it was completely out of the circuit by default. Turns out the internet is wrong, and it makes no noticeable difference being in or out of the circuit when at the bypass position here. So that didn't do anything, but the rewiring did help the guitar sound better. Now, after receiving both of these vintage ES345s, I was pretty surprised by the tonal differences compared to this guitar. So I decided to try and swap in several different sets of pickups to see if I could get it a bit closer. So what I landed on are the Rewind electric custom T-tops I have. And yeah, we'll see later if I got close or not with this set. But they do have lightly aged covers. Finally, the last mod I did was just replace the stock ABR1 bridge, which had nylon saddles, with this Callahan steel bridge. And that was just an effort to brighten the guitar up when I first got it. So yeah, this guitar has just been a fantastic part of my collection for some time now. It's extremely stable, easy to play, and yeah, just an attention getter with the color. So love this guitar. All right, so with all the guitar details out of the way, we can now transition over to the playing portion. So we're gonna run them through 3 different amps and a pretty wide range of gain levels and playing styles to hopefully give a pretty holistic view of each guitar and how they compare. All right, let's get to it. right, before I say anything, go ahead and drop a comment with how you thought they compared and maybe add in what your favorite was. Those are always fun to read back later. So for me, I've got a lot of thoughts. I'm gonna try and keep it pretty brief though. Ultimately, you know, my opinion doesn't matter that much and you guys have ears so you can hear for yourselves. But as a player, maybe there's some things I picked up on that you don't over YouTube. So really the biggest takeaway for me was just how awesome the 64 bridge and middle position was, the Sunburst here. It just felt and sounded really special. The bridge in particular had this really neat extra presence and top end to it, and a lot of drive as well. It just kind of pushed the amps in a really cool way. You know, it reminded me a lot of good PAF tones where it's got that single coil presence and character, but it's just kind of got some girth and pushes the amps more. That's really what I think that sounded like to me. It didn't have the same amount of dynamics as the other two guitars, where if I picked lighter, it didn't clean up as much. But that guitar just wants to rock, to be honest. That's just kind of what it does. On sort of the other end of the spectrum, we've got my blue Reissue here. So that has, again, the rewind T-tops in it. And it was really interesting to me because that guitar just seems to have a really strong mid-range character. It had more of a rounded top end, and to me it was really easy to listen to. It didn't have the same amount of sparkle as the other guitars, but was very even sounding. It didn't really have, you know, any dominating frequencies that poked out. You know, the neck position's a good example. The other two vintage guitars, the low end is really dominant on the neck, whereas that guitar is all very even. So in my eyes, it was just kind of consistently good across the board. Different for sure, but good. And as I mentioned, you know, before, I tried several different sets of pickups in that guitar. And to be honest, none of them got close to that vintage presence and top end that those two had. So to me, that just says this guitar has a voice that's just more mid-heavy, which is certainly not a bad thing. It just goes to show that there's more to the equation than just the pickups, of course. As for the Cherry 65, overall for me, it landed somewhere in between the other two. It had a weaker output, so really good clarity. The neck seemed clearer than the 64, but the middle, interestingly enough for me, was a lot less bright than the 64. In general, it just didn't seem to have as much mids as the blue guitar, and it sounded great, it sounded super good, but I just kind of kept coming back to the middle and bridge of the 64. It is worth noting that I think the 64 could get harsh pretty quickly with all the extra top end presence it has. And when I'm setting up the amps for these kind of tests, you know, I'm walking the line, I'm trying to make sure that it's a neutral tone, but it doesn't make any, you know, it's not too dark for a darker guitar and not too bright for a brighter guitar. So you can always adjust, you know, those things. And on that guitar, I really find rolling the bridge back a little bit just makes it sound just that much better, but I left it wide open to just keep all things even in the test. All right, with the tone out of the way, let's go ahead and talk a bit more about the physical differences between the guitars, especially the Reissue versus the vintage examples. So we'll start with the neck shape. All three are actually really similar. So the 65 definitely has the skinniest neck, but it's not a dramatic difference. And then the 64 and 64 Reissue are very, very similar. I'd say the Reissue is slightly more rounded, but the feel is really, really close. So Gibson did a really good job with that. As far as the rest of the body, well, that's where things get a bit more interesting, just a little bit. Just by looking at the guitars side by side, I immediately noticed two things. So first, the horns on the Reissue, they just look more pointed to me. So the vintage guitars are definitely more rounded. It's not, you know, Mickey Mouse levels, but it's nowhere near as sharp as the Reissue. The second thing I noticed was that the Reissue looked physically smaller than the vintage guitars. I actually grabbed a tape measure, and sure enough, there's a pretty sizable disparity between them. So the widest point of the guitar body on the Reissue measured under 16 inches, was about 15 inches and 14/16. Meanwhile, the 64 measured 6/16 of an inch, or more than a third of an inch bigger. The 65 was a touch smaller than the 64, but still wider than 16 inches at the widest point. I thought that was super bizarre. I did some research, turned to the forums, and was able to get some additional data points from a few different owners of both Memphis and current Nashville Reissue ES guitars, and they all measured roughly the same. just under 16 inches. So super weird. Even weirder, my 2012 ES330 measured the biggest of them all at it was 16th of an inch bigger than the 64. So quite a bit bigger than the current reissue, which is interesting. Naturally, I had to check the depth of guitars as well to just see how close they were. And again, more differences were found. So the vintage guitars were both thicker than the reissue. If you're curious, the reissue is roughly 1.7 inches deep, while the 64 was 1.75 and the 65 was 1.81 inches. So very interesting. Okay, so what else is worth mentioning? Honestly, the more I looked at them, the more I noticed some things. So the pickguard's a good example. The pickguard on the reissue is just the wrong size, and the mounting hole is in the wrong spot. So a vintage pickguard or a replica pickguard will not fit on the reissue, which is frustrating. The easiest place to look to kind of notice that or spot the difference is by the neck pickup. So most vintage guitars will have the pickguard reach the binding or get close to it. Some won't be exactly on the binding, but they'll have more there than the reissues. And even if there isn't, you'll notice there's pickguard after the mounting screw, whereas on the reissue it goes straight into the beveled edge. So yeah, just one of those things. I understand why Gibson didn't match the little gap by the bridge pickup that vintage pickguards will have. I understand that, so that doesn't really bother me, but the other side of it does. Other little issues, they kind of continue in a lot of places. So the tuners on the reissue, they're double ring cloisons, which is not vintage accurate. ES345s would have all been single line. See, another easy one to spot is the crown inlay on the headstock. So the reissue crown has a skinnier waist to it, while the vintage ones are just kind of wider. The logo inlay is another thing. So the little curve and flourish on the N is pretty far off on the reissue. The headstocks are all slightly different sizes and shapes. These little things, they're kind of nitpicky, but considering this is supposed to be essentially a copy or clone, and taking into consideration Gibson's massive resources, I feel like these things should be dead on. Finally, I guess the last thing worth mentioning is the binding. So the super thin neck binding they have on the reissue is just like the vintage guitars, so they nailed that. When it comes to the body binding though, it's pretty far off, to be honest. The 345s have multi-ply binding, and the black layer on the reissue is like twice as thick as what's on the vintage guitars. Now, this is something you would never, ever notice unless you had them side by side. But, I feel like Gibson shouldn't have any problem getting something like that right. And that kind of nicely just segues us into my conclusion of how the reissue stacks up to the vintage guitars. Gibson gets a lot right, undoubtedly. This guitar is a fantastic instrument. Inspires me every time I play it. As an instrument, it is superb. But as a reissue, it just feels like Gibson is perfectly content with getting it roughly there and calling it good enough. There's no question the vintage guitars look, feel, and sound different. The differences are pretty palpable when you have them in your hand. Now, does that mean I would sell that guitar and sell other guitars to get a player grade vintage guitar? No, not for me. But I understand why some would. This is an amazing guitar. It doesn't sound exactly like this, doesn't feel exactly like that, but it's still an amazing guitar. And a good Gibson at the end of the day is hard to beat. And a good old Gibson is even harder. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks again to Daniel for loaning me these awesome instruments. Please check out his Instagram linked in the bio. Give him some love. I would appreciate that. And yeah, if you guys like these sort of videos, go ahead and drop a comment. Let me know. Give the video a thumbs up if you feel like it. Subscribe if you feel like it. And otherwise, I'll catch you guys next time. Later.